Every man gives his life for what he believes. Every woman gives her life for what she believes. Sometimes people believe in little or nothing, and so they give their lives to little or nothing. One life is all we have, and we live it as we believe in living it, and then it is gone. But to surrender who you are and to live without belief is more terrible than dying, even more terrible than dying young. Hello and welcome back to episode 3 of The Watchman. I'm your host, Nathan, but as always, Jesus is running the show. The quote I just read are the final words uttered by Joan of Arc as she was being burned alive at the stake at the young age of just 19. She was told to renounce her beliefs and she would be let go, but she refused to do that and instead gave us this famous last quote. I'd say that she had more guts than most Christians have nowadays. In fact, most of us may even choose to stay quiet about our faith just so we won't have to endure a little persecution, if you can even call it that. We don't want to be made fun of. We don't want people to laugh at us. Honestly, we're a bunch of soft and weak Christians these days, myself included. I hate to admit it, but I have avoided telling someone about Jesus because we were in a public space and I was worried about what the other people within earshot would think or would say to me. How pathetic is that? The last part of Revelation 2, verse 10, Jesus says, "Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life." Paul says in Philippians 1:21, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." How many of us can truly say that? In order for us to be willing to die for something, we have to truly believe that it is the undeniable truth. We have to believe without a shout of a doubt that is indeed true. And even then, would we have the courage to die for it? The only way that I would be willing to die for something is if I knew that I would come back to life. That is exactly what Christ did for us when he died on the cross. He gave us a way to come back to life. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 54 and 55 say this. Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? Jesus said these words to Martha when her brother Lazarus had died and he was about to bring him back to life in John 11:25 and 26. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Well, do you? I'll tell you who did believe that. All of Jesus' disciples certainly did. Every single one of them, except for John, was murdered for their faith in Jesus. Many people today would pose the question, how can we trust that what is written in the Bible about Jesus is actually true? How do we know that the authors didn't just want to paint Jesus in a good light because they were his dear friends and loved him? Well, the fact that most of the men that were close to Jesus were all killed for their claims that Jesus is God is a pretty compelling argument if you ask me. Would you be willing to die for a lie? Probably not. Do you think that all of these men would have been willing to die for Jesus if they had not actually witnessed his miracles and saw him alive again after being tortured and crucified? I don't think so. So, we can make a pretty compelling case for Jesus by looking at the lives and, of course, the deaths of these men. And that is exactly what I want to do right now. We're going to take some time to look into what happened to these men and see if there is actually any merit to their stories. I'm just going to take you on a brief flyover of a few of the disciples who were martyred, as well as Paul the Apostle, who was not one of the original 12 disciples, but was definitely a devout follower of Jesus. Before we get into it, I want to give credit where credit is due. I got most of these facts and these references from 2 books. First, A Case for Christ, written by Lee Strobel, and second, The Fate of the Apostles by John McDowell. I also used the online version of the Britannica Encyclopedia. Again, this is only going to scratch the surface of this topic. I just don't have enough time to go into depth on this in just one podcast episode. Maybe later on down the road, I can do a series on this topic, but for now, I just want to get your brains thinking about it and encourage you to go and read the 2 books I mentioned. If you're struggling with the belief that Jesus is really the Son of God and that he actually did die and come back to life. The first disciple I want to look at is Peter. Peter is the most mentioned apostle in the New Testament. He is the first to be called by Jesus in all 4 of the gospel accounts. Let's take a quick look at Luke's account in Luke 5 verses 1 through 11. So it was, as the multitude pressed about him to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesaret, and saw 2 boats standing by the lake, but the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, "Launch out into the deep, and let down your nets for a catch." But Simon answered and said to him, "Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats, so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will catch men." So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. Here we see Peter's first interaction with Jesus. He was just out doing his job. Just another normal day for Peter. He probably woke up that morning, scrolled through his Instagram feed, sipped on his latte, kissed his wife before heading out to work. But really, we see here that he was just another guy like you and like me. He had to get up and go to work. He had to feed his family and pay the bills. As we read this passage, we can see that Peter was not really having a good day. They had not caught any fish that day. He was probably stressed out and just wanted to go home, sit down in his lazy boy, watch some TV. But when Jesus asked him to put the net in the water one more time, he obeyed him. And they caught so many fish that their nets started breaking. Peter immediately recognized the power of God and fell on his face in front of Jesus. He knew that he was not worthy to even be in Jesus' presence. But instead of Jesus saying, "You know what? You're right. You are very sinful. Get out of here," we see him calling Peter to come and be his disciple. I love this story because it shows us that God will come and meet us right where we are at. We don't have to get cleaned up or fix everything in our life before we come to Jesus. He will meet you wherever you are in life and call you just as you are. And the greatest part is, he will not leave you where you are at. He will change your life in ways you cannot even imagine. It definitely won't be an overnight change, but little by little, he will mold you to be just like him. Looking at Peter's life, we can see that he is nowhere close to perfect. We see many times where he screwed up, but that's a discussion for another day. In the end, Peter ran his race to the best of his ability and ended up being so bold in his faith that it got him murdered for it. If we look at John 21, verses 15 through 19, we see Jesus predicts Peter's death. Let's go ahead and take a look at that now. So, when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him again a second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Most assuredly, I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished, which when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish." This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." Jesus tells Peter that his hand will be stretched out, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. Many scholars believe that this is in reference to Peter being crucified, because Jesus says his hands will be stretched out, just like they are during a crucifixion. Now, we don't actually see anything written in the Bible about Peter's actual death account, so we have to go to other historical documents to find out how he died. There are two historical writings that I want us to look at. There are even more outside of these that you can check out on your own, but these are the two that I chose to include here. The first document is 1 Clement 5, 1-4. This document is said to be written by St. Clement of Rome as a letter to the Corinthians, similar to Paul's letter that he wrote to the Corinthians. This letter is said to be dated somewhere around 95 or 96 AD, although some scholars believe it to be written much earlier. This is what it says. But to stop giving ancient examples, let us come to those who became athletic contenders in quite recent times. We should consider the noble examples of our own generation. Because of the jealousy and envy, the greatest and most upright pillars were persecuted, and they struggled in the contest even to death. We should set before our eyes the good apostles. There is Peter, who, because of unjust jealousy, bore up under hardships not just once or twice, but many times. And having thus borne his witness, he went to the place of glory that he deserved. We see here Clement is referring to the persecution that Peter faced and his eventual death because of his witness of Christ. Next, I want to look at two writings of Tertullian called The Prescriptions Against Heretics and Scorpius, said to be written around AD 208. In the Prescription Against Heretics 36, he writes, "How happy is its church, on which apostles poured forth all their doctrine along with their blood, where Peter endures a passion like his Lord's, where Paul wins his crown in a death like John's, where the apostle John was first plunged, unhurt, into boiling oil, and then remitted to his island exile." And in Scorpius 15, we see him speaking more directly of Peter's death. He writes, "And if a heretic wishes his confidence to rest upon a public record, the archives of the empire will speak, as would the stones of Jerusalem. We read the lives of the Caesars. At Rome, Nero was the first who stained with blood the rising faith. Then is Peter girt by another, when he is made fast to the cross." We see in both of these writings that Tertullian speaks about the death of Peter. There are multiple other sources that will corroborate the martyrdom of Peter, but we just do not have enough time to get into all of them here. I really encourage you to go do your own research on these documents, so you can come to your own conclusions about them. Peter was probably the most prominent apostle and is mentioned 181 times in the New Testament. Thus, it is important for us to understand that he was a real person and that he did indeed die for his beliefs. This fact alone is a huge step in proving that the Bible is accurate in its historical context. The next apostle I want to look at is Andrew. Andrew is best known as Peter's brother, and he was called at the same time Peter was. We see this in the account that we read in Luke 5. His calling story is basically the same as Peter. We can also see this in Mark 1, verses 16 through 18. This is what it says. "And as he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew his brother casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Then Jesus said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men.' They immediately left their nets and followed him." Although Andrew is not mentioned as much as Peter in the New Testament, he is still a very important figure and an eyewitness to the death and resurrection of Jesus. Peter may have been the more outspoken brother, but Andrew was the brother that was always bringing people to Jesus. We see this in John 6, verse 8, where he brings a young boy with a basket of bread and fish. We see this in John 12, verses 20 to 22, where he decides to take some Greeks to Jesus who want to worship him, and of course, we see that he was the one to actually bring his brother Peter to Jesus in John 1, verses 41 to 42. If you look at Acts chapter 5, you see that the apostles were persecuted and imprisoned for teaching the people about Jesus. Andrew would have been one of these apostles that was in prison. This tells us that he was willing to endure much for his faith in Jesus, even to the point of death, which we're going to look at now. But really quick, as a sidebar, I want to mention verses 38 and 39 of Acts 5, since I mentioned the passage. This is a bit off topic, but I just really love these two verses. This is what they say. "And now I say to you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this work is of men, it will come to nothing. But if it is of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest you even be found to fight against God." Basically, these two verses are telling us that if whatever plans that we as Christians have are truly from God, no man will be able to stop them because they will be fighting against God himself. Isn't that so awesome? Anyways, back to the martyrdom of Andrew. Although there are many sources cited for the death of Andrew, most of them allude back to the Acts of Andrew, which is one of the apocryphal Acts that was believed to be written somewhere between AD 150 and AD 210. To be straightforward with you, the sources that are written about James's death are considered to have some elements of a creative license and some legendary elements, but the Acts of Andrews is, for the most part, considered to be a pretty historical document. Andrew is said to have been crucified by Agiates because of his involvement in converting his wife Maximilia to Jesus. Although the account of Andrew's death are not as strong as some of the accounts of the other apostles, it is considered to be a reasonable conclusion considering the evidence that we do have for it. Up next, we have the apostle James of Zebedee, commonly known as the brother of John of Zebedee. It is assumed that James is probably the younger brother, since he is always referred to as the brother of John. James was called at the same time as Peter, Andrew, and his brother John, which we read about earlier in Luke 5. Again, we have another everyday blue-collar guy choosing to live his life behind to go follow Jesus. James is considered to be one of the inner circle apostles, along with Peter, Andrew, and John. We see James at the Mount of Olives in Mark 13 having a very personal conversation with Jesus. We see him with Jesus when he raised Jairus' daughter from the dead in Mark 5. We see him at the transfiguration of Jesus in Mark 9. We see him in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus was betrayed by Judas in Mark 14. And then in 1 Corinthians 15, we see that James witnessed the resurrected Jesus. Looking at the life of James, we can see that he was an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, miracles, death, and his resurrection. Knowing all that we know about him, the fact that he was killed for what he believed to be true is very convincing evidence that Jesus really did die and he really was raised from the dead. As I stated before, why would anybody choose to give up their life for something that was just an intricate lie? So, where do we see evidence of James's martyrdom? First, if we look at Mark 10, verse 39, we see that Jesus tells both James and John that they will indeed drink the cup that he will drink. This is alluding to the fact that Jesus was going to be put to death and that they too would be killed for their faith in Jesus. The most obvious place where we actually see James being put to death is in Acts 12, verses 1 to 2. Let's go ahead and read that now. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some from the church. Then he killed James the brother of John with the sword. Now you may say, sure, but that comes directly from the Bible, not from another historical document. Sure, this is true, but the book of Acts has been proven to be very historically accurate, according to many other historical documents outside of the Bible, as well as archaeological records. As I stated before, this is more of a brief flyover, and we just don't have the time to get into all of the details of that. I do encourage you, though, to go and do your own research on it and verify that what I'm telling you is actually true. I do have one historical document outside of the Bible that I want to reference. That is, in Book 7 of his Outlines, the Clement of Alexandria references the beheading of James by King Herod Agrippa. Looking at all of this evidence, we can be confident that James was indeed killed for his faith in Jesus Christ. The next apostle I want to look at is John, son of Zebedee. I do want to mention that it is generally accepted that John was the only disciple to die of natural causes and that he was not actually martyred. We do see that John was bold about his faith and that he was imprisoned and even willing to die, if necessary, for what he believed. As I stated before, John is the older brother of James. Once again, we have another blue-collar guy that was called at the same time as the last three men we looked at. John was also a fisherman, out doing his normal, everyday thing when Jesus called him to be his disciple. He, too, chose to drop everything and follow Jesus during his 3 years of ministry. John and James were known as the Sons of Thunder. We see that Jesus gave them this nickname in Mark 3, verse 17. We are not told exactly why Jesus chose to give them this nickname, but we can deduce from other passages as to why they were given the nickname. One notable instance was in Luke 9, verse 51 to 56. Let's read it real quick. Now it came to pass, when the time had come for him to be received up, that he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem, and sent messengers before his face. And as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare for him. But they did not receive him, because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, just as Elijah did? But he turned and rebuked them, and said, You do not know what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went to another village. Here we see that Jesus was looking for a place to sleep for the night, but because he was Jewish, the Samaritan town that they were going through did not let them stay there. Because of this, James and John asked Jesus if he wanted them to call fire down from heaven to burn up the whole town. That's pretty thunderous of them, if you ask me. Of course, Jesus rebuked them for this, and they went on to another village. Whenever we see John mentioned in the Bible, he is listed among the top 4 of the 12 disciples. In Acts 1, we see John mentioned third only after Peter and James in the upper room, just after they watched Jesus ascend into heaven. In Acts 2, we see John with Peter heal a lame man in Jesus' name. In Acts 4, we see that Peter and John were arrested for preaching about Jesus, and when they were told to stop speaking about Jesus, they said that they cannot stop speaking about the things they have seen. John was a direct eyewitness of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Just as we saw James, we saw John at all of the following events as well. We see John at the Mount of Olives in Mark 13. We see him with Jesus when he raised Jairus' daughter from the dead again in Mark 5. We see him at the Transfiguration of Jesus in Mark 9. We see him in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus was betrayed by Judas in Mark 14. And then, in 1 Corinthians 15, we see that John also witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. In a writing from Tertullian called The Prescription Against Heretics, we see that it was believed that John was plunged into boiling oil, but after seeing that he would not die, he was exiled to an island. Many would consider the fact that John was willing to die for his faith, but was spared instead, basically the same thing as actually being martyred. The fact that he was willing to be imprisoned and possibly die for what he saw is very good proof to the veracity of the Bible. Next, I want to take a look at Thomas. We do not have any account of how or when Thomas was called to follow Jesus in the Bible. We do see him mentioned in the lists of the 12 apostles in Matthew 10, Mark 3, Luke 6, and Acts 1. We can be confident that he was one of the 12 original disciples because of this. We see Thomas mentioned 3 separate times in the book of John. The first time we see him is in John chapter 11, when Jesus' good friend Lazarus was very sick. In verses 14 and 15, we see Jesus tell his disciples that Lazarus is dead and that they need to go see him. And then in verse 16, we see Thomas reply, "Let us also go that we may die with him." This is a very bold statement from Thomas. The rest of the disciples were trying to stop Jesus from going to Judea because the Jews there had previously wanted to stone Jesus. Thomas sometimes gets a bad rap, but he was willing to put his life on the line to go with Jesus to see their friends in Judea. The next time we see Thomas is in John 14, where Jesus is in the upper room with his disciples. Jesus is telling the disciples that he's going to prepare a place for them in verses 1 through 4. And then in verse 5, we see Thomas telling Jesus he doesn't know where he is going or how to even get there. Thomas loved Jesus very much and wanted to make sure that he knew how to stay with him. These two passages show us just how devoted Thomas really was to Jesus. The last passage is why Thomas is widely known as Doubting Thomas. It is due to the fact that he refused to believe that Jesus had actually risen from the dead. We see in John chapter 20, verse 25, he says, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Thomas was in shock and despair at this point. The man that he had dedicated the last 3 years of his life to and loved very much was just brutally murdered. Jesus had already appeared to the other disciples after his death, but Thomas wasn't with them at that time. The disciples were trying to convince Thomas that they really had seen Jesus alive again, but he just could not believe it without seeing it himself. And who could really blame him? And then, about a week later, we see Jesus appear to the disciples again in verse 26, and this time Thomas was there too. Jesus even tells Thomas, "Go ahead, put your finger in my hands and your hand in my side." I really love this because it just shows that if we really are searching for Jesus and ask him to give us proof, he will show himself to us in many different ways. Jesus had already shown himself to the other disciples. He could have just said, that's good enough. Thomas should believe his friends because all of them are testifying to seeing me. But Jesus didn't do that. We see how personal Jesus is with Thomas and that he loved him so much that he came back just to show Thomas that he really was alive. This tells me that Jesus really does care about every individual person. Now that we have learned a little bit about Thomas while he was alive, let's take a look at some of the evidence that he was martyred for his faith. First off, the passage we looked at previously in Acts 5, where the apostles were imprisoned for preaching about Jesus, would have included Thomas as well. We see that after an angel miraculously frees them from prison, they go right back to preaching about Jesus. Again, the fact that these men were willing to be so bold about their faith, even under persecution, says a lot about the truth of their words. Looking at other historical sources outside of the Bible, we see that Thomas is spotlighted in quite a few of them. He is the main character in the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which was written somewhere between AD 140 and AD 170. The Gospel of Thomas, written around AD 150. The Book of Thomas the Contender, written between AD 150 to AD 225. The Acts of Thomas, written between AD 200 to AD 220. And the Apocalypse of Thomas, written around the 6th century. In the Acts of Thomas, we see that he was thrown into prison in India by King Misdaius and was eventually put to death by 4 guards with spears. As we saw before with the Acts of Andrew, the Acts of Thomas is considered to have some embellishments within its text, but is generally considered to be historically accurate when compared to other historical documents. One king that is mentioned in the Acts of Thomas is King Gondophares. This is significant because in 1834, archaeologists found ancient coins with his name inscribed on them around the area that Thomas was said to be preaching in. They also discovered some ancient ruins of a building that is believed to be King Gondophares' palace. These findings help prove the authenticity of the information that was written in the Acts of Thomas, and we can therefore conclude that the account of Thomas's death is most likely accurate as well. If you really think about it, the fact that Doubting Thomas, the man that was ready to throw in the towel and not believe, was willing to die for his belief that Jesus is God is really strong evidence for the truth of the Bible. If Thomas had not actually seen Jesus alive from the dead, he definitely would not have been willing to die for just a lie. The final person I want to look at is the Apostle Paul. Although Paul is not one of the original disciples, he is a very prominent figure throughout the New Testament. In fact, he is actually credited with writing 13 books of the New Testament. Those books are Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Ephesians, Philemon, Colossians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. Some scholars would also credit Paul with writing Hebrews, although that is not totally confirmed. Paul is considered to be one of the main founders of the early church. The testimony from Paul and his willingness to die for his faith is one of the biggest keys to proving that Jesus really was who he said he was. That is, that he was the Son of God, that he really did live on this earth and do many miracles, and that he did physically die and physically come back to life. So let's get into the life of Paul now. Paul was not like the rest of the original 12 disciples. In fact, he was the complete opposite. Before he was known as Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus. We see in Acts 22 that Saul was a Pharisee who was trained by Gamaliel, a member of the Sanhedrin. We also see that Saul was actually persecuting the church before he was converted and changed his name to Paul. He would imprison and torture Christians. At the end of Acts 7, we even see that Saul, or Paul, presided over the stoning of Stephen, who was the first martyr of the church for Jesus. Saul hated Christians and truly thought he was doing a good thing by silencing them. It really makes you think, why would a man that hated Christians and was out to get them flip-flop his stance and even end up dying for Christ in the end? The only logical answer would be that he actually saw the resurrected Jesus himself, and he finally realized that everything all of these Christians had been preaching about was true. Well, that's exactly what happened. If you look at Acts 9, you will see Saul getting ready to go to Damascus. What was the reason for his trip? It was to find and imprison any Christians that he could. Saul was on a mission to end this new movement for Jesus. But wouldn't you know it, as Saul was on his way to Damascus, Jesus actually appeared to and spoke to him. Before Saul knew who it was, Jesus asked him why he was persecuting him. Saul asks, "Who are you, Lord?" And of course, that's when he found out that it was Jesus and that he really had risen from the dead. From this point on, Saul dedicated his whole life to spreading the gospel, even to the point of death. In Acts 13, verse 9, we see that Saul no longer goes by that name, but instead starts going by Paul. And can you really blame him? Everybody knew Saul as the crazy man that was out to kill Christians. I believe he started to go by Paul in order to try and distance himself from the past. Now that we have some background on Paul, we can start to look at the evidence for his martyrdom. Again, as I stated before, the fact that this man used to kill Christians and is now willing to die for the same exact thing that he was trying to kill them for speaks volumes to the fact that he really did see the risen Jesus. If you look at 2 Corinthians 11, you will see that Paul was whipped and beaten many times. He was stoned, he was shipwrecked multiple times, and he was constantly in danger. He was put in prison many times for speaking about Jesus. In fact, many of the letters that he wrote from the New Testament were actually written from a prison cell. Even after all of that suffering, he never once wavered from his belief in Jesus, and eventually ended up dying for it. We don't actually find the death of Paul recorded in the Bible, so we have to look at extra biblical sources to confirm it. The conventional view of Paul's death is that he was beheaded in Rome somewhere around AD 54 to AD 68, give or take. There are multiple historical sources outside of the Bible that'll corroborate the fact that Paul was in Rome. We can find this evidence in 1 Clement 6, which was written around AD 95 to AD 96, in the letter to the Romans written by Ignatius and Scorpius, written by Tertullian around AD 208. Although we do not find the actual execution of Paul in the Bible, if we look at 2 Timothy 4, verses 6 through 8, we can see Paul alluding to the fact that he will most likely be put to death. If we go back to 1 Clement 5, where we saw the death of Peter, we also see that Paul was mentioned with him. In verse 2, we see that he suffered even unto death. And in verse 7, we see that it says Paul was set free from this world. Both of these verses imply that Paul was killed for his faith. If we look at Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, we see that many people are mentioned to have died for their faith, along with Paul and other disciples. It says this, "Therefore I urge all of you to obey the word of righteousness and to practice all endurance, which you also observed with your own eyes, not only in the most fortunate Ignatius, Zosimius, and Rufus, but also in others who lived among you, and in Paul himself and the other apostles. You should be convinced that none of them acted in vain, but in faith and righteousness, and that they are in the place they deserved with the Lord, with whom they also suffered. For they did not love the present age, they loved the one who died for us, and who was raised by God for our sakes." If you look at the book, The Acts of Paul, and also back at Scorpius 15, written by Tertullian, where we saw the death of Peter also, you will find the evidence for the beheading of Paul. In conclusion, the fact that all of these men that we have discussed were willing to die for what they believed is pretty good evidence to the Bible being true and to the fact that Jesus died and rose again. All of these men were eyewitnesses to the risen Jesus, and they lived their lives as proof of that, even until death. There are many other apostles that were killed for their faith, and as I stated in the beginning, we just do not have enough time to go over all of them. There is also a lot more evidence than I gave here for the 6 men that we did look at. I strongly encourage you to go and do some more research for yourself if you're still in doubt. The Bible tells us that if we truly are seeking for God, we will find him. Jeremiah 29 verse 13 says, "You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all of your heart." Deuteronomy 4:29 says, "But from there you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him if you seek him with all of your heart and with all of your soul." If there is anybody watching or listening who has heard all of this and has decided that everything we talked about makes too much sense and that they want to give their life over to Jesus and start to follow him just as these men did, I would love to give you an opportunity to do just that. If you want to give your life to Christ, go ahead and repeat this prayer after me. Lord Jesus, I know that I have been living a life that is not pleasing to you. I have sinned against you. I ask that you please forgive me of my sins and come into my life. Please make me a new person. Give me the boldness to live for you, just as these men that we have discussed. Please make me a new creation and help me to live the life that you want me to live. Thank you for dying on the cross for me and for raising again. You have defeated death for us, and now I no longer have to fear death, just like these apostles. Thank you for loving me and for saving me. In your holy name, amen. Amen. I am so happy and blessed to get to be here and to do this podcast. If you did give your life to Christ today, I would love to hear about it. Please comment below, or I'll leave a link for my email address either down below or somewhere on this video. If you have any questions or comments, concerns, those are always welcomed as well. Thanks again for tuning in, and y'all have a blessed day.